Here we are at week two, ancient Egyptian art. And it's amazing because I'm still discovering about art and life in the ancient Egyptian times. So, as we proceed through the presentation, just make a note of dates and names, but they're not as important to remember as sort of the elements of art are. If you've had a chance to look at the discussion question, think about it. Are emojis the new hieroglyphics? What do you think? Take some time to think about it, reflect on it, and write about it. And hopefully, we'll get a little discussion going with the class. Personally, I think emojis are universal. Essentially, we can all speak emoji. But does that make us more connected because we all speak that universal language? And here's the presentation overview. I'm going to start with a little 101 on ancient Egypt. I'm going to talk about the elements of ancient Egyptian art, give you some specific examples with Palette of Narmer, and talk about King Tut and Nefertiti. And I threw in a little something extra for you guys, mummy portraits. Really cool. So stay tuned for that. And of course, cats and influences of ancient Egypt in the 20th century. So, Ancient Egypt 101. This will include a discussion into civilizations and dynasties, more to give you a sense of the scope of the history. The pre-dynastic period was from 5000 to 3100 BC. This is a connection to the Stone Age or the Neolithic connection between the northeastern African communities and the development and advances in agriculture in Egypt, which led to the development of arts and crafts, technology, politics, and religion, including a great reverence for the dead and possibly a belief in life after death. Around 3400 BC, two separate kingdoms were established near the Fertile Crescent, an area home to some of the world's oldest civilizations. The Red Land to the north, based in the Nile River Delta and extending along the Nile, and the White Land in the south. Remember this, as it will come up briefly when gleaning over crown styles and colors. Around 3100 BC, King Menes would subdue the north and unify the country, becoming the first king of the first dynasty. Pharaoh means great house. Pharaohs were considered gods who led the government. The Archaic or early dynastic period was from around 3100 to 2686 BC. King Menes founded the capital, known as Memphis. The Archaic period saw the development of the foundations of Egyptian society, including the ideology of kingship. To the ancient Egyptians, the king was a godlike being, closely identified with the all-powerful god Horus. The earliest known hieroglyphic writing also dates to this period. In the Archaic period, as in all other periods, most ancient Egyptians were farmers, living in small villages, and agriculture, largely wheat and barley, formed the economic base of the Egyptian state. The annual flooding of the Great Nile River provided the necessary irrigation and fertilization each year. Dynasties. Dynasties were families who ruled for a good number of years and did some impressive things. What changed? A family would be overthrown, there might be no heirs, so bring in a new family. And there's about 30 dynasties in the Egyptian history. The Old Kingdom, the age of the pyramid builders, which was around 2686 to 2181 BC. The Old Kingdom began with the third dynasty of pharaohs. Around 2630 BC, the third dynasty's King Dozier asked Imhotep, an architect, priest, and healer to design a funerary monument for him. The result was the world's first major stone building, the Step Pyramid at Saqqara near Memphis. Egyptian pyramid building reached its zenith with the construction of the Great Pyramid at Giza, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus estimated that it took 100,000 men 20 years to build it. Like presidencies, there are good presidents and not so good ones, just like the dynasties. When they were good, there was prosperity. When they weren't so good, there was chaos and stagnation. The Middle Kingdom, the 12th dynasty, was around 2055 to 1786 BC. Egypt, once again, was flourishing. Middle Kingdom Egypt pursued an aggressive foreign policy, colonizing Nubia with its rich supply of gold, ebony, ivory, and other resources. The kingdom also built diplomatic and trade relations with Syria, Palestine, and other countries, undertook building projects including military fortresses and mining quarries, and returned to pyramid building in the tradition of the Old Kingdom. This period had the first confirmed female ruler of Egypt and the last ruler of the 12th dynasty. The Middle Kingdom dynasty had a flourishing art scene with lots of jewelry making and incredible trading power. Construction projects, such as the water wheels of the Fayum region, diverted floodwaters of the Nile, and the Pyramid of Hawara, the labyrinth, had about 3,000 rooms. So it was pretty impressive construction projects happening in this Middle Kingdom dynasty. And next I'm going to talk about this really cool thing known as mummy portrait. Oh, here we're at my favorite mummy portraits. These examples were found at Hawara in between 1888 and 1889 and 1910 and 1911. They are from the period of Roman rule, which was about 600 years, starting around 30 BC. These painted panels are an important historical and artistic record. They illustrate the application of Greco-Roman art to Egyptian burial customs at the beginning of the first millennium. Also, they demonstrate the cross-pollination of the arts amongst cultures, but are not misappropriation. There's differences between influenced by, inspired by, borrowing, stealing, and certainly misrepresenting. These portraits appear to be naturalistic in style and are portraits of an individual while acting as part of the funerary equipment needed for entry into the afterlife. The wooden boards would have covered the face of a mummy. The most fascinating fact about these portraits is that they were painted during the lifetime of the people whose mummies they were to decorate. This image of a young man dates to around 140 to 160 AD. That's because of the style and of the hair and beard indicates that period. And he was nicknamed the Red Youth due to the reddish-brown skin tones of the sitter. One of the founders would name the images of the panels he found and would write short character sketches about them. The portrait panels have been cut out of their wrappings and are displayed separately from the physical context in which they were found. When first exhibited, these panels in London, they were first exhibited in 1889. They were framed like European works of art. Now, that would completely change the context and misrepresent their intent. And this certainly would affect how we look at these mummy portraits today. Not all panels were removed from their wrappings or their mummies. Some have been displayed with their mummies. Researchers have examined the pigments used by the artists and the order the paints were applied to different regions of the portraits.
as well as the sources of materials and the style of the brush strokes used. The details of the pigments and their distribution led to researchers to conclude different artists painted different portraits. So that certainly can help to lead to understand how painting techniques evolved. In 2001, the results of an analysis examined 200 mummy portraits. They used clinical paleoneurology in the study, a method which is very rarely used in research, but is connected with ancient forensic archaeology. The recognition of neurological diseases in ancient people was made possible by scrutinizing the mummy portraits. The researchers measured 32 skulls excavated in Hawara with portraits suggesting the possibility of a neurological disease. By analyzing the specific way white paint was applied in the eyes of the portraits, it was discovered that some of the people probably had focal epilepsy, hemiplegic migraine, and even autonomous nervous system dysfunction. The examination of the mummies confirmed that 2 people had progressive facial hemiatrophy and 3 had deviations of the visual axes.
Okay, we've covered off the Old Kingdom, we've covered off the Middle Kingdom, and now it's time for the New Kingdom, which was around 1567 to 1085 BC. Under Ahmose the first king of the 18th dynasty, Egypt was once again reunited. During the 18th dynasty, Egypt restored its control over Nubia and began military campaigns in Palestine, clashing with other powers in the area, such as the Mitannians and the Hittites. The country went on to establish the world's first great empire, stretching from Nubia to the Euphrates River in Asia. Amenhotep IV of the late 18th dynasty undertook a religious revolution, disbanding the priesthoods dedicated to Amon-Ra, a combination of the local Theban god Amon and the sun god Re, and forcing the exclusive worship of another sun god, Aton. He was so into this concept that he renamed himself Akhenaton. So now we've gone from polytheism to monotheism. All of the New Kingdom rulers, with the exception of Akhenaton, were laid to rest in deep rock-cut tombs in pyramids in the Valley of the Kings, a burial site on the west bank of the Nile opposite Thebes. Most of them were raided and destroyed, with the exception of the tomb and treasure of Tutankhamun, discovered largely intact in 1922. King Tut's biggest claim to fame wasn't how he ruled, but for his tomb. Here's a fun fact: all pharaohs, including women, wore beards. In real life, most ancient Egyptian men were clean shaven, but pharaohs often wore fake beards, usually made of metal, as a symbol of their connection to the gods. Contemporary depictions of Hatshepsut portray her in traditionally feminine clothing, wearing a false beard. Queen Hatshepsut ruled the country for 22 years. It was a record of sorts, since no other female pharaoh had ruled so long or been as successful as a ruler. Now I'm just sliding in a fun pic of evidence that Egyptians played a variety of games. So here's an example of chess. So, sort of, in my opinion, an early version of the Queen's Gambit. Remember that sort of Netflix hit of 2020? All right, let's dig into some elements of art. Figures are placed on the axis, axiality, and frontality, and they are very, very rigid. They are somewhat static, formal, blocky, and abstract. For the Egyptians, art was a communication tool, and text often accompanied the images. The majority of art was not meant to be seen. Faces did not express emotions. Proportion of figures were related to the width of the palm. Proportions of children did not change. They were just depicted smaller, just like servants, just like animals. Size was based on importance. Because of axiality, proportion, and hieratic scales, artists used math for the composition, and grid lines may have been seen. Important figures did not overlap, but servants could. Each object or element in a scene designed and drawn from most recognizable angles. Gestures reflected meaning of what the person was doing. They did not attempt to render the real world. Scenes were ordered in parallel lines known as registers. The registers could act as ground lines for figures and separate scenes. The higher up the scene, the higher the status. And the registers were characterized by the idea of order. Clear and simple lines, simple shapes, flat areas of color equaled a sense of order and balance. Colors were more expressive than natural. Blue or gold indicated divinity. Black, for royal figures, expressed the fertility of the Nile. Detailed depictions of gods, humans, battles, and nature were fairly typical. Surviving works designed and made to provide peace and assist the deceased in the afterlife. There was a desire to preserve the present, represent socio-economic status, and belief systems. All right, now we're going to talk about the Narmer palette, or palette of Narmer, which is a cartouche, an oval or oblong enclosing a group of Egyptian hieroglyphs, typically representing the name and title of a monarch. The palette of Narmer is so valuable that it has never been permitted to leave the country of Egypt. Interesting to keep this in mind when we unpack King Tut's tomb and take it on its grand tour of the world. It was discovered in 1898. Discovered amongst a group of sacred implements ritually buried in a deposit within an early temple, this large ceremonial object is one of the most important artifacts from the dawn of Egyptian civilization. The carved palette is more than 2 feet in height and made of smooth, grayish-green silt stone, is decorated on both faces with detailed low relief. These scenes show a king, identified by the name as Narmer, and a series of ambiguous scenes that have been difficult to interpret and have resulted in a number of theories regarding their meaning. The high quality of the workmanship is its original function as a ritual object dedicated to a god, and the complexity of the imagery clearly indicate that this was a significant object. What was it used for? The object itself is a monumental version of a type of daily use item commonly found in the pre-dynastic period. Palettes were generally flat, minimally decorated stone objects used for grinding and mixing minerals for cosmetics. Basic cosmetic palettes were among the typical grave goods found during this early era. In addition to these simple, purely functional palettes, however, there were also a number of larger, far more elaborate palettes created in this period. These objects still serve for the function of being a ground for grinding and mixing cosmetics, but they were also carefully carved with relief sculpture. Research suggests that these decorated palettes were used in temple ceremonies, perhaps to grind or mix makeup to be ritually applied to the image of the god. Temple caches of this type are not uncommon. There was a great deal of focus on ritual and votive objects, offerings to the god, in temples. Every ruler, elite individual, and anyone else who could afford it donated items to the temple to show their piety and increase their connection to the deity. After a period of time, the temple would be full of these objects, and space would need to be cleared for new votive donations. However, since they had been dedicated to a temple and sanctified, the old items that needed to be cleared out could not simply be thrown away or sold. Instead, the general practice was to bury them in a pit under the temple floor. Conventions that remain the same for thousands of years. There are several reasons for the Narmer palette is considered to be of such importance. First, it is one of very few such palettes discovered in a controlled excavation. Second, there are a number of formal and iconographic characteristics appearing on the Narmer palette that remain conventional in Egyptian two-dimensional art. These include the way the figures are represented, the scenes being organized in regular horizontal zones, again known as registers,
and the use of hierarchical scale to indicate relative importance of the individuals. In addition, much of the regalia worn by the king, such as the crowns, kilts, royal beard, and bull tail, as well as other visual elements, such as the pose Narmer takes on one of the faces, where he grasps an enemy by the hair and prepares to smash his skull with a mace, continued to be utilized from this time all the way through to the Roman era. So what's on the palette? The king is represented twice in human form, once on each face, followed by his sandal bearer. He may also be represented as a powerful bull. In addition to the primary scenes, the palette includes a pair of fantastic creatures known as serpopards. Serpopards, leopards with a long, snaky neck, who are collared and controlled by a pair of attendants. Their necks entwine and define the recess where the makeup preparation took place. The lowest register on both sides includes images of dead enemies, while both uppermost registers display hybrid human bullheads and the name of the king. The name of the king, written hierographically as a catfish and a chisel, is contained within a squared element that represents a palace facade. One interpretation of the palette of Narmer is the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. Some have interpreted the battle scenes as a historical narrative record of the initial unification of Egypt under one ruler, supported by the general timing, as this is the period of the unification, and the fact that Narmer sports the crown connected to Upper Egypt on one face of the palette and the crown of Lower Egypt on the other. This is the first preserved example where both crowns are used by the same ruler. The scene showing Narmer wearing the Lower Egyptian red crown with its distinctive curl depicts him processing towards the decapitated bodies of his enemies. The two rows of prone bodies are placed below an image of a high prowed boat preparing to pass through an open gate. This may be an early reference to the journey of the sun god in his boat. It is interesting to note that the enemies are shown as not only executed, but rendered completely impotent. Their castrated penises have been placed between their legs. On the other face, Narmer wears the Upper Egyptian white crown, which looks like a bowling pin, as he grasps an inert enemy by the hair and prepares to crush his skull. By wearing both crowns, Narmer may not only be ceremonially expressing his dominance over the unified Egypt. The imagery preserved on this palette provides a peek ahead to the richness of both the visual aspects and religious concepts that develop in the ensuing periods. It is a vitally important artifact of extreme significance for our understanding of the development of Egyptian culture on multiple levels. Nearly lost to history, King Tutankhamun was only the age of 9 when he became the king of Egypt during the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom. Tutankhamun died at the young age of 18, leading many scholars to speculate on the manner of his death. Chariot accident? Murder by blow to the head? Even a hippopotamus attack? The answer is still unclear. His tomb was discovered in 1922 by the archaeologist Howard Carter in the Valley of the Kings, the royal burial ground. His nearly intact tomb held a wealth of objects that give us unique insights into this period of ancient Egyptian history. He was running out of money to support his archaeological digs, but was granted one more year. At the beginning of November 1922, Carter came upon the first of 12 steps of the entrance that led to the tomb of Tutankhamun. Carter spent a decade systematically recording the finds and having them photographed. King Tut's sarcophagus, a box-like stone container, held not one but 3 coffins in which to hold the body of the king. The outer 2 coffins were crafted in wood and covered in gold, along with many semi-precious stones such as lapis lazuli and turquoise. The inner coffin, however, was made of solid gold. When Howard Carter first came upon this coffin, it was not the shiny golden image we see. In his excavation notes, Carter states it was covered with a thick, black, pitch-like layer which extended from the hands down to the ankles. This was obviously an anointing liquid which had been poured over the coffin during the burial ceremony and in great quantity, some 2 buckets full. The image of the pharaoh is that of a god. The gods were thought to have skin of gold, bones of silver, and hair of lapis lazuli. So the king is shown here in his divine form in the afterlife. He holds the crook and flail, symbols of the king's right to rule. The goddess Nekhbet, a vulture, and Wajet, cobra, inlaid with semi-precious stones, stretch their wings across his torso. The death mask of King Tutankhamun is considered one of the masterpieces of Egyptian art. It originally rested directly on the shoulders of the mummy inside the innermost gold coffin. It is constructed of 2 sheets of gold that were hammered together and weigh about 23 pounds. Tutankhamun is depicted wearing the striped Nemes headdress, the striped headcloth typically worn by pharaohs in ancient Egypt, with the goddesses Nekhbet and Wajet depicted again protecting his brow. He also wears the falsi, the false beard, that further connects him to the image of a god as with the inner coffin. He wears a broad collar, which ends in terminals shaped as falcon heads. The back of the mask is covered with spell 151b from the Book of the Dead, which the Egyptians used as a road map for the afterlife. This particular spell protects the various limbs of Tutankhamun as he moves into the underworld. I'm just going to leave this question for you to consider. King Tut toured around, or the findings of King Tut toured around in the late 70s, and again, just a couple years ago. I remember seeing the tour. I was very young, but they had toured the objects found from the tomb to you at the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto. Now, touring this around, do you think that's a form of colonialism? But if King Tut's treasures hadn't been toured around, how would we ever get to learn about them? Or would we ever get to learn about them? Just going to leave that question there hanging for you. Queen Nefertiti is best known for her painted sandstone bust, which was rediscovered in 1913 and became a global icon of feminine beauty and power. One of the most mysterious and powerful women in ancient Egypt, Nefertiti was queen for 17 years, co-ruling and possibly ruling solo. Her reign was a time of tremendous cultural upheaval as Akhenaten reoriented Egypt's religious and political structure around the worship of the sun god Aten. Akhenaten's transformation of religion brought with it radical changes in artistic conventions. Departing from the idealized images of earlier pharaohs, Akhenaten is sometimes depicted with feminine hips and exaggerated features. Early images of Nefertiti show a stereotypical young woman, but in later ones she is a near mirror image of Akhenaten. Her final depictions reveal a regal but realistic figure. Okay, here we are back at our chess-playing queen. The beauty of the iconic Nefertiti bust may only be skin deep. CT scans in 2009 revealed that underneath the surface of the smooth painted stucco is the sculptor Thutmose's more realistic limestone carving of a woman with wrinkled cheeks and a bump on her nose. So, now we know, vanity does have a beginning. On the walls of tombs and temples built during Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti is depicted alongside her husband with a frequency seen for no other Egyptian queen. In many cases, she is shown in positions of power and authority, leading worship of Aten, driving a chariot, or smiting an enemy. She was discovered buried upside down in the sandy rubble on the floor of the excavated workshop of the royal sculptor Thutmose. And when I say she, I mean the bust. The painted figure featured a slender neck, gracefully proportioned face, and a curious blue cylindrical headpiece of a style only seen in images of Nefertiti. The discovery team had an agreement to split its artifacts with the Egyptian government, so the bust was shipped as part of Germany's portion. A single photograph was published in an archaeological journal, and the bust was given to the expedition's funder, a Jacques Simon, who displayed it for the next 11 years in his private residence. A year later, the Nefertiti bust was put on display in Berlin, countering the English Tut with a German appropriation of ancient glamour. Throughout the 20th century's upheavals, the bust remained in German hands. It was revered by Hitler, who said, "I will never relinquish the head of the Queen," and it was hidden from Allied bombs in a salt mine and coveted by East Germany throughout the Cold War. And now I'll let you take a moment to read about why cats. The big thing is that they were domesticated in the ancient Egyptian period and they were exported. And now we know they've taken over the world. The last section is about Egypt's influences, which started in the 18th and 19th century, where the British became fascinated because the Rosetta Stone was deciphered. The importance of this to Egyptology is immense. When it was discovered, nobody knew how to read ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. Because the inscriptions say the same thing in three different scripts, and scholars could still read ancient Greek, the Rosetta Stone became a valuable key to deciphering the hieroglyphs. The stone is a broken part of a bigger stone slab. It has a message carved into it, written in three types of writing called scripts. It was an important clue that helped experts learn to read Egyptian hieroglyphs, a writing system that used pictures as signs. So why is it so important? The writing on the stone is an official message called a decree about the king, Ptolemy V. The decree was copied onto the larger stone slabs called stelae, which were put in every temple in Egypt. It says that the priests of a temple in Memphis, in Egypt, supported the king. The Rosetta Stone is one of these copies, so not particularly important in its own right. The important thing is that the decree is inscribed 3 times in hieroglyphs suitable for a priestly decree, Demotic, the native Egyptian script used for daily purposes, meaning the language of the people, and Ancient Greek, the language of the administration. The rulers of Egypt at this point were the Greco-Macedonian after Alexander the Great's conquest. The Suez Canal opened. It connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Indian Ocean by way of the Red Sea, allowing goods to be shipped from Europe to Asia and back more directly. And it was just not that long ago in the news when there was a ship with the containers on it that blocked the entire channel. Its value to international trade made it nearly an instant source of conflict among Egypt's neighbors and Cold War superpowers vying for dominance. So one of my favorite periods in the 20th century is the Art Deco period. The geometrical influence representational forms, such as shapes and lines, are represented in the Chrysler Building and the Cartier clock. So why was the Art Deco period influenced by ancient Egypt? Well, it emerged in the 1920s, and what we know in the 1920s was we knew about King Tut and the discovery in 1922. And again, there was an Egyptian revival in the 1970s when the King Tut exhibition toured the world. So why is there that sort of fascination? Well, other cultures are always interested in the other. There's interest in decorative motifs and patterns, something new and original seeming. The 1920s also saw the rise of skyscrapers. Possibly, somebody's thinking, oh, that's like the rise of pyramids, these massive structures. So here we are imagining spin-offs and marketing in the 1920s, then again in the 1970s, and again in the 21st century, which I mentioned that King Tut had toured not that long ago, just before COVID. Hope you enjoyed this presentation and learned a lot. I'm sure it was a lot to take in. So thanks so much for listening.